We are live on Facebook now. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Melissa Giroux, and I am a co-founder of Embrace Race. Are you guys still having trouble with the volume? Because I can try to change that. I'm a co-founder of Embrace Race, and I'm a mixed race Black, white woman. And I'm here with Andrew. Actually, not here in the same space tonight, but usually I'm here with him. Andrew?
Yeah, I think this is the first time we haven't been in the second time we've been on the same screen. The first time we actually haven't even been in the same place at all. I'm Andrew Grant Thomas, also a co-founder and identify as Black or African American. And it's great to have you all here. It's going to be a great program.
We're excited about it. And Embrace Race, for those of you who don't know, is a community of support for parents, grandparents, uncles, teachers, therapists who want to do their part about raising, a generation that is thoughtful, informed, and brave about race. So we have Talking Race and Kids is the webinar series that you're listening to right now. And we invite people to learn with us. It's a regular series and we're always learning, and we invite you to do the same as well. There'll be webinars that are about people like you and webinars that are not about people like you, but we invite you to them all. So tonight we're really excited. This is a topic that, the slide's a little wonky, but this is a topic that is really close to my heart. We're talking about colorism, or the politics of skin color in the family in particular. Same family, different colors. And colorism, I think, is so foundational, so important to how racism and racist structures work, but it's often not talked about, even less than race, and it's often very confusing to people just what the connection is between sort of race and color, and particularly racism and colorism. So we're excited tonight to talk to Lori Tharps, who Andrew will introduce in a moment. We're going to talk to Lori about how, in particular, colorism shows up in families. Let's see, and we're defining it as the preference for or presumed superiority of people based on the color of their skin. Lori's written an amazing book that is so chock full of how did this happen, how did we get here, what is people's experiences, and also, I haven't told her this, but it's so funny. I think it's also funny. I mean, it's not a comedy, but she is interviewing lots of people, and her sort of point of view as an author is really fun and interesting, and also thought-provoking and deep. So it's a really great ride to read that book, and I recommend it. So Lori's going to come on. Andrew's going to introduce her. We're going to talk to her for about 25 minutes, and then we're going to turn to your questions. And many of you have sent in lots of questions, and I'm sure more of you will have questions once you hear Lori speak. So I'm going to turn it to Andrew.
Lori Tharps is an associate professor of journalism at Temple University, as well as an award-winning author, journalist, educator, podcast host, and a very popular speaker. She's the award-winning author of 4 critically acclaimed nonfiction books, including Same Family, Different Colors, Confronting Colorism in America's Diverse Families. She lives in Philly with her husband and 3 children. She blogs and has a podcast at myamericanmeltingpot.com. She is almost fluent in Spanish and can say, I love you in 7 languages. Come on in, Lori.
We're going to test you on that, Lori.
Oh, no. No, please don't. Although I think I can do it, but I under pressure, I might, forget something. But
give us one, Lori. Give us one.
Te quiero.
There you go.
No, that's great.
Gonna dive right in, Lori, and we always like to start with this question about really the guest's personal investment, right, in the issue. So we'd love to hear about the book, right, why you chose to write this book, and perhaps especially about, what is it about, right? This is about colorism, largely about colorism in families. What is it that you can share with us that would give us some insight into your interest in this topic?
Sure, it's a great way to start. So I'm a journalist first. I consider myself a storyteller, but my training as a writer is in journalism. And every book that I have written has started with, a personal kind of question of my own. My first book was about Black hair, hint, hint. My second book was a memoir, and then I wrote a novel, and even the novel was mildly inspired by my own kind of personal experience becoming a mom. But Same Family, Different Colors is probably my most, even though I wrote a memoir, I feel like it's my most important book that comes from my personal experiences, and that is because I'm married to a Spanish man, and I gave birth to 3 children who are 3 distinct skin tones, 3 distinct hair textures, and none of them look like me or my husband. So my experience as a parent was deeply influenced by this concept of colorism that is not something I really had a lot of experience or a lot of conscious experience with. Although when I went back to think about my childhood, I realized that both of my Black parents had their own kind of, upbringing that was influenced deeply by colorism, and therefore it trickled down to me. But because I grew up in mostly white spaces, the only 2 colors I was really worried about were Black and white, and I was Black and everybody else was white. But as a parent, I have 2 sons, one who could not be mistaken for anything else but a Black child or a child of color, let's say. He has afro hair, brown skin. And my other son is very pale, has very loosely curled hair, and is mistaken for anything but Black, And so right around the time that Trayvon Martin was murdered, and everybody was talking about, how do we raise our Black sons? I was not only having that conversation and thinking about those things, but I was also trying to figure out, how do I raise, what is the conversation I need to have with my one son who looks visually Black versus my other son who could quote unquote pass? How do I make sure that not only do I give both sons the right message, but how do I make sure that whatever message I'm giving them is not making one feel jealous, one feel slighted? It really, I thought I was prepared to be a good Black mom. I did not know that, how do I parent kids who racially look different? And that was what instigated the question of, how do differences in skin color in the same family affect parenting, affect family dynamics, affect the relationships between siblings? So I wanted to know that answer. And then I figured a lot of other people want to know that answer. And it's not just Black women married to white men, because I know, just being a Black woman from a Black family, that Black families come in all hues. Latino families come in all hues. Asian families come in all hues. So I set out to figure out how this skin color differences manifested, how colorism influenced, these differences in these families, and then ultimately kind of what to do about it. How to make sure that you're parenting. It's not a parenting how-to by any stretch of the imagination, but by sharing the stories of families that have been through this, of individuals who were the light person or the dark person in the family, not to mention talking to some experts, I figured it was a vehicle for helping people to start talking about the issue, and perhaps getting some inspiration from some of the people who, may have been the dark one or may have been the light one and still came out okay.
Right. It's so contextual, right? That you can't, the stories really help, and they helped me, but it's going to be really different depending on so many things, and even the temperament of the child and the people around the child. So it's good to have guideposts, there's not going to be an exact recipe for folks. But I wonder if we could talk a little bit about how you define colorism. I gave a definition at the top, but I noticed in your book that sometimes you use the politics of skin color, in the family. And I wondered, because colorism can be so confusing to people and feel a little bit like racism, racism, it is very connected to racism, but it can have the same shame factor that some people feel about admitting, racist behaviors, right?
Right. So it's interesting, because when I naively went out and said, I'm going to write this book about colorism or skin color politics, I thought it would be a much easier ask to get people to kind of talk to me about these issues. Thinking it's not racism. I know people get nervous when you say racism, but people were just as reticent to talk about skin color, colorism, and a lot of people, particularly outside of the Black community, didn't even use the word colorism. So I had to dial it back because colorism was maybe associated with Black Americans, if at all. And like I found when I was speaking to people in East Asian community, for example, you know, they were like, oh, that's like, they literally didn't even know what I was talking about. And yet when I broke it down, you know, and literally said, well, certain darker skinned Asian people, or for example, I was talking to a Korean girl once and she was saying, we don't have those problems. And I was saying, but I noticed this, you know, if you have darker skin, and then it was like, oh, blah, 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 blah. And I often had to have that conversation more around beauty rituals, right? Because again, the word colorism didn't even resonate with certain people. So I define colorism as a preference for people based on the color of their skin. A lot of people say, or make the assumption that the end of that sentence should be with a preference for lighter over darker. And because we live in a society that has been built upon a foundation of white supremacy, that is often the case. But people do show preferential treatment to people to have darker skin in some situations. This term colorism is about discrimination based on skin tone, right? So that is what I just consider that being colorism. Skin color politics, I think, is a wider umbrella term that can give people more opportunity to, let's say, add the voices of people who were discriminated against because of their lighter skin, for example, or who felt what I call in the book light skin isolation because they're not recognized as part of their ethnic group or something like that. So quite frankly, it's ironic because colorism as a word doesn't even exist officially in a lot of dictionaries. And if you say the word, it gets underlined on the computer as like incorrect. And the word colorist, you know, like a racist, a colorist is somebody who works with makeup or hair colors. So even the terms are not widely necessarily recognized. So that's my definition, but anytime you start having this conversation, it's important to define it for the people who you're speaking with.
Right. I love that. And you focused on the family, right? And how things happen, how this plays out in the family. But I wonder also, we're getting in the chat, I'm seeing people talking about how this plays out in various communities, like someone talked about the West Indies or people from the West Indies here. And Andrew and I happen to have a family from the West Indies. I mean, Andrew's from the West Indies, Andrew's from Jamaica. And on my father's side, they're all from Dominica. So one thing that we often hear, what you said, that, oh, there isn't, skin color isn't a thing, but then you go and you notice all the people who are in reception are very light colored, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of not discussed. So I wonder if we could sort of look back just for a second and talk about how the trends we can see in how people are treated differently if they're sort of on the darker side or the lighter side.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because we say that, we've both of us have talked about how this manifests differently in different cultures. It's all very, everybody's, has this different experience. But in writing the book, I spoke, there's 4 sections. I talk about the African American community, the Latino community, the Asian American community, and I'm situating these people in the United States because I had to somehow connect, this in some way. And then the mixed race community. And there's a lot of differences of how different cultures come to prioritizing certain skin tones, whether it's colonialism, whether it's a class thing, whether it's, a history of slavery, obviously. But the don't play in the sun, the don't get too dark if you want to be married, moms teaching moms influencing daughters, dads influencing daughters, boys being taught what to prioritize in terms of a lighter skinned bride. These stories that I get, you can, kind of close your eyes and that's my story, but it's also the Bangladeshi young woman's story. It's also the Dominican woman's story. It's also the African American woman's story. So the manifestation of what happens when people are prioritizing one skin tone over another, it looks the same. In terms of the family, right? The damage looks pretty much the same. The tears, the trying to bleach your skin or wipe the skin color off looks the same. And likewise, the child that has lighter skin and perhaps isn't seen as part of the family or isn't part of the community and tries to overcompensate by doing maybe dangerous behavior or excessive behavior or exaggerating an accent or majoring in, African American studies, Latino studies, because they have to prove somehow externally that they're part of the tribe, right? It doesn't, those stories are, you pick the cultural group and it doesn't matter. You can mix and match and you still get those very similar stories. And that's, what I came away with after spending, 2 years plus looking at how colorism manifests in different cultures, which gives me kind of hope because we're not talking about something that's so unique to one group that they're going to, die trying to figure out how to solve it. It means if we kind of open up between groups and start discussing these things, perhaps we'll get to a solution a lot faster because we're all suffering with the exact same problem.
Right. So, yeah, Andrew.
So Lori, if sort of, discrimination by skin color, right, by skin tone is pervasive, right, across within groups, across racial, across race and within racial categories. As you said, we seem collectively to be even less willing to talk about, what we are calling colorism than we are about racism. We know that we're infamously reticent to talk about racism, right? At least until recently, and that's still a relative thing. I'm just wondering, why is that? I mean, you pointed to a number of sort of different origins for sort of color politics within different groups, but part of what's fascinating to me about this is even groups, what you might call cultural groups or racial groups that are where colorism is clearly a thing, right? And where, yes, you as soon as you start talking about what you're talking about, people recognize it, often aren't aware that it's also a thing in other groups, right? Like that's how close the conversation is. Right. So can you give us some insight onto why that might be?
Well, I think because it's a really good question. And I think it might be because if you admit that within your own cultural group, you're infighting, that you're parsing through who's better because of their hair or because of their skin tone, then the white man is going to be like, look, you people can't even agree upon X, Y, or Z yourselves. It's like we can't break ranks publicly and show that we're infighting over essentially what has been quote unquote done to us by this idea of white supremacy. There's a certain taboo nature. I mean, colorism, I talked about it in my book, is this taboo topic that you only talk about, behind closed doors. But I really think it's because, it's we don't air our dirty laundry out in the open. The fact that, you have to put in some cultures, the idea of being lighter is very public, but what you necessarily do to make yourself lighter or to keep yourself light is still, quietly done in the back room, right? But I really think there's that too, the privacy element of I don't want anybody to know what I do to make myself look darker or lighter. And again, it's not just the lighter. I've talked to a lot of people who talk about putting darker, lighter skinned people who buy a makeup 2 shades darker than they really should because they want to appear. And I'm not talking about these crazy stories we've been hearing about white women who are have been posing as black. I'm talking about legitimately light-skinned individuals who buy makeup darker so that they can appear darker. But that's not something they're talking about, because there's an inherent kind of personal shame to that, that I'm not naturally the color I should be. And likewise, the reverse, if I'm lightening my skin and doing some sort of beauty treatments or something like that. So you have the one thing where we can't give the white man, I'm using big air quotes with that, but we can't give the white man another reason to say we're defective, right? Or that we can't even get these things, like, let's not give them another way to show that we're divisive, right? And then there's the whole kind of personal private shame about, if I'm this color and I want to be a different color, I want to be a little darker, I want to be a little lighter. That's a private that's like a personal private stance, if you will, about, how I present myself to the world and what I have to do. Again, maybe my mom's telling me, maybe my dad's telling me, maybe I'm just feeling it myself, but I'm going to take care of it, again, behind closed doors. So I think there's a lot of shame because it feels very personal. Racism is very public. It's very like group oriented, but colorism is individual, right? It's about you personally, what you look like. It's not your global race. It is your personal appearance that you're being judged by.
Right. And so maybe finding the language to make it more of an open conversation, which you are trying to do with politics of skin color, or talking about, as you do, and as people in this chat have, about it really being about white supremacy and anti-Blackness, right? Within whatever group, you want to be closer to, there's a preference. There's the colonialized, preference for lighter, but then we're sort of trying to compensate for that, and counter that by saying the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice, which, I have that experience, I've talked about this before, of being with my kids who are different shades, and I'm obviously a passer, someone who can pass, depending, right? Not up to me. And and talking about, darker, brown skin being so beautiful. I wish I had, all of this, which, was a secret wish, of course, to not be so confusing. And my younger daughter turned to me and said, "Mama, do you not like your skin?" And so it's really hard when you're trying to counter sort of a racial hierarchy, and a colorism hierarchy. How do what I was trying to do was go like this, because I knew this was getting in, right? But it actually doesn't work, right? It really doesn't work. So that really, and I just thought about it, and I said, you're right. That's what I'm suggesting, and I need to think about that. And mommy, so I do remember, and I really recommend that people watch the OWN documentaries, Light Girls, and there's Dark Girls and Dark Girls 2, which is, cross cultures about sort of skin color. And I remember watching the one where Raven, everybody, whatever that show, Raven, That's So Raven, that she would tan for her show because she was so embarrassed by how light she was, and she was not considered Black enough, which just is heartbreaking, right? To imagine someone in the limelight feeling like they had to do that.
It's funny because, people assume that being light is the prize, right? That's what people want. And through my research, it's not to be light or to be dark. It's really the people who are like, there's studies that, if you could score like contentment with identity around race and color, it's people who are medium. Like these, people who are light struggle with being too light, right? Not being identifiable. People who are too dark struggle with, of course, discrimination that's just based on, anti-Blackness, and that's like anti-dark skin. So really it's the people, I consider myself kind of, like I said, I never thought about myself as too dark or too light. So I didn't really think about colorism because I didn't have to. And the absurdity of all of this, of course, is it's all relative, because I could walk somewhere and someone could tell me you're really light, or I could walk somewhere and someone could tell me you're really dark, because it's all based on perception anyway, right? if you're told your whole life that you're really light, then you believe it until you go someplace where people are lighter than you, and suddenly you're swarthy. It's just like it's so absurd in that way. But the point is that when we think about, oh, light girls have it so lucky, or darker men are so considered so virile or powerful, really where people feel the most content is people who literally just fall somewhere in the middle. And I think obviously any extreme can be difficult and challenging.
Lori, we definitely, as you said, the book isn't a how-to parenting book,
No.
but certainly you have some ideas. You have some. There it is.
Yeah.
So certainly you have some wisdom for us. Before we get to that, I wonder if you could say something about, right? You talked a minute ago about, or 5 minutes ago about, how it's seen. Whereas racism and discrimination are often seen as sort of public phenomena, right? That colorism is seen as sort of a private one, as personal, as private, happens, it's seen as happening largely within the confines of the home or in sort of other private spheres. Can you give us a sense of what that looks like, especially among people who probably don't recognize that they're doing it, certainly don't mean to be harming their children or setting up these hierarchies, but nevertheless may be doing it. What might that look like?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because we don't talk about it openly enough. It's not in parenting classes. It's not even, like I said, it's not even a word according to some. It just became a word, I think, like 2 years ago. One dictionary finally recognized it. So one of the things that, the clearest example, of course, is preferential treatment for a child that is darker or lighter. There are parents who, because of their own biases, are treating their lighter child like she or he is more smarter, attractive. You pick the positive attribute, and that parent is is doing that, or giving that kind of treatment to that child because of their lighter skin. Also the opposite can happen, where I think Melissa was saying, I'm not sure if this is what you were implying, but if you have a light child and a dark child, it might be that you are overcompensating and teaching that dark child that they're so beautiful, maybe paying more attention to them, trying to make sure that when they go out into the world, they're not being, they're prepared for the discrimination that's going to come. But then in turn, the lighter skinned child feels that they're not good enough. They don't like their skin. They should be darker. They spend a lot of time tanning in the sun. I know personally, again, this is something I heard from a lot of people who grew up with mom or dad saying, don't put more sunscreen on. You're going to get too dark. They don't say it. They don't straight up say, because you'll be dark and ugly or you'll never get a man. Some people still say that, but people think, oh, I would never say that. But they're still implying you don't want to get a tan. You don't want to get dark. Well, why not? Well, you won't be pretty. Or people will think you're a peasant. That happens a lot of people in East Asian communities, where there's an association with darker skin with more like a lower class society. So these just don't get dark. Don't, put some more sunscreen on, put some more cream on so your skin is pale. And then, of course, what you might also see or hear is parents praising, public figures, like, isn't she beautiful? Oh my gosh, she's so beautiful. And look at her hair. Don't you want to have hair like that or something? Which again, they're not examining why they're praising this person, but they don't say things about, a different person who maybe has darker skin or lighter skin, whatever the case may be, if there's like this pattern. So, or like Melissa said, which I need to get darker. That kind of thing, where you are inadvertently showing your child that there's something wrong with you based on your skin. And it can happen the same way with darker parents who will say things like, oh my God, I don't want to get any darker. I don't want to get in the sun. I got to put a lot of sunscreen on, or I don't even go outside because, I can't get any darker, or I can't wear this color. People my skin tone can't wear bright colors, kind of already giving these kind of messages to their children that there's somehow something about them is, inappropriate or not right, and they have to fix it. And we do know also colorism extends beyond just the shade of your skin, you know, the texture of your hair, some features, but it's that kind of, and that's why it's very, this often starts in the home because it's under the guise of, you know, taking care of your skin or picking out the right clothes you can wear and the shades of makeup you should be wearing or how you're styling your hair. And that's why we accidentally pass these ideas on to our children because we don't recognize that we're simply kind of parroting what we were taught, or we're trying to, you know, prepare our children for these messages that we think they're going to get out in the real world. And it does take a whole lot of self-reflection to realize, gosh, am I really, like, I guess I've had these ideas that, like, oh yeah, that doll is prettier because it has this kind of, I don't know, maybe cinnamon color, and I think that one's pretty. Why am I ignoring this darker doll? Or, you know, vice versa, wherever your biases linger. But that's often what it looks like in the home. And I mean, the good news is that we can all be aware of that and kind of dial it back. I mean, that's the thing, is nothing is like, there's nothing we can't, I mean, unless your kids are gone out the house, but like, there's nothing really that you can't kind of undo with some very intentional kind of remessaging and bringing in other kind of content and just honest, transparent talks with your kids.
And Lori and Melissa, let me just follow up on one quick thing, because you know, Lori, you mentioned, you know, having two sons who are different skin tones, right? And we have a lot of questions and comments, you know, in the registration and now in the Q&A in the chat from families who are the same situation, right? And clearly there's widespread recognition that this is a thing, right, among all those people, and anxiety, I think, among a lot of the people who are listening now about, oh my gosh, am I doing something unwittingly to perpetuate this? And what am I listening for, right? How do I know if in fact some of this is taking hold in sort of my child's imagination and self-perception and all of that stuff? So can you say, I mean, you've said, you know, a lot that already gives us some insight into what we might be seeing from children,
right?
But can you give us a little bit more? What might we hear from them?
Yeah, it's and you know, as a mother of boys, I thought I was clear from the kind of beauty talk and the hair talk that I would expect with, you know, daughters. But, you know, my sons went to, they were at a school that was relatively diverse, and yet they still, at one point when they were like 7 and 10, were talking about wanting hair that moves. Like, I think it was Justin Bieber was popular at the time, and he was doing his little thing with that hair thing. And I was shocked because I was like, what have I done wrong? But the way for me, the response was, if you want hair that moves, you can grow dreadlocks because those move, right? It wasn't like, I didn't freak out. I think it was very normal at that point, for the kids to see this popular figure, you know, even though whatever. They saw Justin Bieber. You couldn't not see Justin Bieber in the early 2000s. So that was my response, was, you want hair that moves? Great. We can have hair that moves. Black hair is amazing. It can do all those things, right? So you may hear something like that. Like, I want to have some sort of, you know, physical characteristic that somebody who's darker or lighter has, right? You may have a child say something like, I don't like him because he's so dark. Like, I've heard children, like, that's, you know, stories that we've heard. I've heard children say, I don't like him because he's so dark. Now, again, instead of saying, don't say that, that's terrible, because then you shut down the opportunity to interrogate why the child thinks that. Why is the darkness of their skin bad? And, you know, maybe the child will say, well, it looks like dirt, or they're so dark, or maybe they don't have an answer. But this is the opportunity not to shut it down, but to have the conversation, and then to maybe, you know, bring out, this is why, you know, one of my recommendations is to really normalize skin color differences, not to make them a hierarchy, but just to say, like, look at the colors of the human rainbow. As many ways that you can do that, as many times a day, to the point where then when you have that conversation, it's like, Don't you remember, like, humans come in 17,000 shades? There's a Pantone like image that shows all the different tones of the human skin. I think every family should have that, to start showing their children, look at all the shades that humans come in. So something like that, mommy, I don't like her because she's too dark, or I don't like her because she's so light and she thinks she's better than everybody else. Now, if you think there's a girl who's better, but okay, but is it because she's light that you think that? And if so, let's interrogate that, right? So all of these things, because of, we can't keep our kids in, well, it's COVID, so you can keep your kids in the house all the time, but in general, they're going to go out, they're going to have these conversations with other people, they're going to hear these things, and they can bring them back into the house. But the thing is, not to shut it down, but to critique their thinking and have the conversation with them. And ideally, if you have in your home, in your household, in your family, people who are different shades, you can, have the conversation and have examples that you can point to and say, well, maybe your favorite, maybe this character on this TV show or in this movie or in this book, they have skin that color. Is that person think she's better than everybody? Or remember that story we read where people thought that so-and-so was better than her and it made her feel really bad? All these types of things. So that's, I think, how we might see it. As kids get older, there could be some animosity between siblings, which through no fault of the parents, there still could be the brother who's lighter, who gets more girls, gets more attention at school. The brother who is darker gets more negative attention, has been stopped by the police. And so in between the two brothers, there's tension. That could happen as well. And that definitely requires parental intervention, to really, again, that's somebody else's problem, not theirs, and it doesn't change, who your children are fundamentally. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's definitely something where if you see it and you have conversations about it, you can hopefully, at minimal, not keep the bonds in the family from being destroyed by outside influences around colorism.
Well, that's a great point. It does, there are folks in the chat, and it's certainly true that although you learn about a lot of this, or many people develop their colorist views at home, a lot of it's brought into, there's plenty, there's plenty to be brought in, at school, in terms of finding those stories and those television shows, like you said. It's still, we need people creating that content to be aware of colorism as well, right? Mm-hmm. And you did write a bit in your book. You talked to some researchers about studies. There's been, like, Veshla Weaver and Jennifer Hochschild did those great studies about people across, like, even people across races, if they were asked to look at, here's a politician who's a light-skinned Black man, and here's one who's a dark-skinned Black man, and they were asked who was more trustworthy and things like that, and they'd think the lighter-skinned one was more trustworthy. So part of what's problematic about colorism is it also is happening in our families and in our, within racial communities, but we're also harming people outside of our immediate racial ethnic communities by being colorist, right?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, it's really important for people to recognize that white people are very colorist as well. And so that's why, again, this conversation cannot stay in the silos of different ethnic communities, because we all are, we all have biases, and we all, again, when people talk about, a light-skinned Black man is more likely to get a job than a dark-skinned Black man, or darker-skinned girls in school tend to be disciplined worse than lighter-skinned girls, and all these different things. Who is making these decisions? Who's having these disciplinary hearings? Who are these teachers? They're white people in a lot of cases, because everybody is operating under a white supremacist system where we default to this idea that the lighter skinned person is smarter, more beautiful, has all the qualities that we're looking for, is better behaved. And so it's not just within the Black community, Black people think this, or within the Latino community, Latino people think this. We're all, you know, working with that same kind of problem.
Andrew, do you want to go? Oh, you're muted, sweetie.
Sorry about that. Now, just looking at, we have so many amazing questions, some of which we've already started to certainly incorporate into this conversation. Here's one, right? So, and you've begun to speak to this certainly, but I'll offer it up. How to handle colorism in a biracial family. My husband is white, I'm Korean, our kids look mixed. One identifies more with Asianness, the other with whiteness. Very confusing and decisive and divisive, spurred by events during this administration.
Yeah, I mean, that is such a good question, and it's one that so many people struggle with. And it doesn't even have to be a mixed family, you know, a family that's, you know, just colorful. You know, you can still have somebody that comes out very light and one that's very dark. One can be white passing, and another one just can't, you know. But in this particular situation where you have a child that kind of embraces their ethnic side and one that's embracing the white side, it is divisive. It's very hard. I think for the parents, though, there's a couple of things to consider. If well, she said that both kids looked mixed, right? So if both kids look mixed and so they're essentially making a choice, then I feel like it is the parents' responsibility to help each child in their own unique identity. We can't force a child to believe or to act a certain way. And if they feel more connected to their Asian side, or they feel more connected to their white side, whatever that means, then that's what they have to do. What is important for the parents to do is to interrogate, for example, if that white child is rejecting their Asian side, right? There's one thing, I mean, it's okay for a child to embrace different parts of themselves at different times. And everybody does this, whether you're mixed or not, right? But if there's an attitude of rejection, I think that's when you need to really make sure that the child doesn't hate themselves, doesn't hate that part of themselves, isn't rejecting it. And if they are, why? And again, this is very delicate. And if they're, you know, depending on their age, it might be really hard to get them to talk about what they're really feeling. But it is incumbent upon the parents because if they're rejecting it, there's a reason why. Maybe they've been bullied. Maybe they've read things that make them feel very negatively about that part of themselves. If it's the current administration, maybe they're just scared. They don't want to identify with the people that are being beat up, right? I mean, who wants that? I mean, nobody wants that, especially a child. So I think then again, it's the parents' responsibility to try to get at what that child might be saying with that, I'm embracing my white side. Is that more I am rejecting this other part because I'm scared of something, or I've been told something negative about that. And then you kind of have to go a little bit over time, trying to kind of show the good parts and why that it's okay to embrace your whole self. And again, I think it's important to make sure that you're not trying to make them think that if they embrace their Asian side, they can't embrace the other half of themselves too. Like, don't make it an either or situation.
Mm-hmm. So we do have a lot of questions from parents who are interested in doing their own internal work, who've been struggling, which is awesome, who've been struggling with colorism themselves. And one person asks, how can I work through colorism and not pass it on to my child? I've been struggling with this since my son was born because he's much lighter complected than me. And it brought up a lot of internalized feelings about light versus dark-skinned African Americans that I didn't know I had. Mm-hmm. I have so much shame about my feelings, you know, that surprise or insecurity in him not looking like his mom. And while I know that it will take time to work through this, in the meantime, I don't want to affect my son. So I wonder if you'd have anything to say to her.
Absolutely. I feel, first of all, I feel you, I hear you. I have two very light children. And I mean, the many times that people asked if I was their nanny, Somebody actually almost tried to force me to take my son to the hospital to make sure he was actually mine. They thought I needed to get a DNA test. That does a real number on you, feeling like you are being questioned, even if that kid is yours. And then the feelings you have of maybe you're feeling like you want your kid to be darker for multiple reasons. My thing is, one, that's very normal thoughts. Do not feel shame about them. That's 100% natural that we want our children to look like us, to have similar experiences that we have, or that we want them to be recognizable as, again, part of our tribe. So that's the first thing. Your feelings are normal. Do not try to suppress them or negate them. Second, the best thing you can do is try to talk to other people. There are lots of people who are in the exact same boat. There's a Facebook group called Black Women Raising Light-Skinned Children or something like that. I mean, there's truly a lot of people in that same situation. So rather than stewing and trying to suppress those feelings, talk about them. And this is the point, is like when we suppress them, they don't go anywhere. And then maybe you are going to even not even intentionally pass them on to your kids. Get them out. Talk about them. Talk about them every day. And then try very hard to, just talking about it, you may get ideas from other mothers in similar situations, other parents, but also in talking about it, you release some of those feelings, and they're not so strong. And it allows you then to look at your child and, again, see what's good about their skin tone, reinforcing it in telling them, and you're kind of teaching yourself at the same time that you're teaching your child to love the skin that they're in, right? We're trying to teach our children that skin tone doesn't mean good or bad. So the more we teach them, we're teaching ourselves too, because we come from a different generation where it really didn't feel that was true. And now we get a chance to undo those kind of negative messaging for our kids. And if we really believe that, the creator, God, the universe, whatever you believe, whoever created skin tones didn't make a mistake. They're all there for different reasons. Then if, again, we're teaching our children this, then we're teaching ourselves at the same time, and hopefully the message soaks in. But don't suppress those feelings. They're totally normal, totally natural. Find healthy adults that you can talk about them with.
Yeah, and I really do think Lori's book is amazing for that as well. Same family, different colors, because there are just so many stories. So many. You interviewed so many people, Lori, that all of you are going to find someone. Most of you are going to find someone like you in these pages, and often a lot of stories, or even if people are in different ethnic groups, their stories are very similar. So I think that's helpful. And I agree, talking about it is, quite literally healing, right?
Lori, we've focused a lot in this conversation on the sort of circulation of these messages within families, right? And especially what we might call nuclear, perhaps even extended families. Mm-hmm. But of course, it's clear that that is not a closed system, right? There are these messages are being circulated all over the place, and sometimes the family isn't the refuge, right? So we have a number of several questions and comments from educators who are seeing, right, the circulation of those sort of colorist messages in families, right, between parents and children. They're observing this and they're concerned. You mentioned delicate 10 minutes ago. That's a delicate situation. What can educators do to support children who they think might be sort of subject to these kind of colorist messages?
Yeah, I mean, it takes a village, and that's 100% true. And sometimes, sometimes parents just aren't they're just not able to do what they need to do along these lines. And so educators, again, they're the second line of defense, and they can, again, in their classrooms, reinforce the message. My biggest message from this book, and thank you, Melissa, for saying that. I do think that if people read the book, they'll get some ideas. But the number one message from this is to normalize difference. If adults taught children that humans come in multiple skin tones, and that there is no attachment, there is no skin tone hierarchy from a scientific perspective, and this is what educators can do. How did we get different skin tones? When people migrated, away from the sun, some people were lighter, some people were darker so that they could absorb more melanin so they didn't die of vitamin D deficiency, right? This is just this is a biological adaptation to the distance to the sun. Skin tone, hair textures, right? Nose width, it's biology, it's evolution, right? Or maybe you shouldn't call it evolution depending what state you live in. But the point is, this is simply a biological adaptation to the nearness to the sun. So let's start with science. Then let's talk about if we see different skin tones, just like we see different flowers, they're different colors, humans are different colors. What difference does it make if a rose is red or a rose is white or a rose is yellow? Are they all roses? Yes. Do they all smell delicious? Yes. Are they all beautiful in a bouquet? Yes. Why is that any different with human beings, right? Teachers can do a very methodical kind of talk, and they should incorporate this into their social studies lessons in their kindergarten all the way up to 12th grade about what skin color really means. There's a really good book, and Nina Jablonski is the author, and I think it's just called Skin, but she literally does the evolution of skin. In addition, every school, elementary school teacher should have a really great list, a collection of books in their classroom that talks about skin colors and why skin colors are different. And also, the types of books that offer and show different characters with different colors. So again, if we're saying, hey, skin tones, everybody comes in different colors, and you can have smart people and athletes and scientists who are all different colors, then you are literally demonstrating, hey, this very dark person is a brilliant scientist. This very light person was the best Dominican, singer, dancer, whatever it could be, but just showcasing the wide spectrum of talented or interesting people. That's what teachers can do.
We have a really interesting question that I think gets to how personal colorism can be, where someone asks, what is the difference between colorism and personal preference?
Oh, good.
The context, some people find certain tones more attractive. I've seen folks describe their this preference as feeding into colorism, which of course it does.
Yeah. So I just have to say, somebody in the chat, I'm not really reading the chat, but things are popping up, and someone just said that Crayola crayons now come in multiple skin tones. Mm-hmm. Every teacher should have all those crayons, because you will start a crisis if the child can't find their skin tone in the crayon box, right? So that's a little tiny thing, but it's that kind of thinking for teachers, how you reinforce that all skin colors matter. They're all just as valuable as the next. So the difference between personal preference and colorism, that's a tricky thing, because people can argue you two ways backwards. I don't know, I make up my phrases, but people can argue till they're blue in the face that it's just a personal preference. It's not like I'm saying darker skinned people or lighter skinned people are ugly, whatever. The thing is, we all have biases, preferences, and influences, right? So we live in a society that was built on a foundation of white supremacy, and European colonialism also kind of spread across a large swath of the rest of the world. And it cannot be understated that almost all people have some sort of belief or have been influenced by standards of beauty or attractiveness that come from either accepting white supremacy or deeply rejecting white supremacy. I've seen people of color say, I only like light-skinned women or men. And it's literally because they have felt so badly as a dark person that they aspire to at least get somebody lighter than them to either make sure their kids aren't as dark as them, or simply because, again, they have felt so negatively about themselves that if they can find a partner who is light, somehow they've achieved something. And we see that all the time. Likewise, there are people who are very light, who their preference is darker people because they have been accused their entire life of being too light. And so that attraction to the darker skin tone is, a manifestation of their own, feeling rejected as who they are. can you take that away? Can you separate that from preference? I mean, if your preference is not to have yourself always be judged because you're too light or you're too dark, I mean, that would be my preference too, is to stop being judged. So I think all of us, though, can interrogate our own preferences, if you will. But I don't think anybody can do it for you. I don't think it's anybody's business to try to figure out, well, she's just with him or he's just with her. But I would encourage people, young people, you know, I don't want everybody who's in a marriage of someone who's in a different skin tone to be like, I married you for the wrong reasons, I'm out of here. I'm not suggesting that. But if you are young or, you know, and you're still thinking about, you know, who you want to, you know, couple with or whatever, to definitely ask yourself those questions, because we are simply products of our environment. And there are so many messages sent to us on a regular basis about who is worthy, who is attractive, who is strong, who is weak. And again, if you hear, as you hear me using these adjectives, perhaps in your mind, you're like, oh, that's darker, that's lighter, that's darker, that's lighter. And if they're really attached to, like, these qualities, we have attached them to skin tones. And so, and again, both dark and light. This is why I refuse to say that colorism is just a preference for light, because I can show you many a lighter skinned man who cannot be taken seriously as strong and powerful because he's not dark enough, right? So personal preference versus colorism, it is a fine line, but I do believe that that's only can be truly, the truth can only be determined by the individual themselves.
You know, Lori, we've talked about, right, sort of, yeah, colorism, what it is, the, you know, relationship to some degree to race, racism, you know, how it shows up, what we might be able to do about it in the home. And now I'm wondering where this is going, right? And in particular, you know, so we live at a time when, you know, in a moment, clearly, where lots of people, and we won't even get into sort of the basis for this hope, but lots of people are hopeful that we're in, you know, some sort of before, after, or at least a moment of shift around racism and race and people's awareness, and, you know, more people willing to stand up and get off the sidelines, all those sorts of things around racism.
Right.
Given that there is, you know, yeah, colorism and racism aren't the same thing, but they're related phenomenon, I wonder what are you seeing? You know, are you more hopeful, less hopeful than you've been at other times at the trajectory of color, or trajectories, because we know it's several things, right? Several different kinds of manifestations and maybe different kind of dynamics in different communities. How do we assess where this thing is going?
Oh, Andrew, do we have another 2 hours? I wish I could give a straight answer, but I'm going to say I am hopeful that this, what I call Black Lives Matter 2.0 movement that we're seeing right now, will get people to interrogate colorism and not just racism. And I am seeing that. I am seeing people really, really start to talk about anti-Blackness, which is at the base of a lot of colorist thinking, right? Across cultures, you know, and that is fundamental if we're going to get beyond colorism, right? Is anti-Blackness. And we see that again in so many different cultures, right? So in that sense, like I have seen people in Jamaica, in India, in Bangladesh, in these communities here as well, really start to grapple with the anti-Blackness in their own communities, in their own cultures, and of course here in the United States. So that gives me hope. But on the same token, it's like you just turn on the television or, you know, go on social media, and there's still infighting, light skin, dark skin. There's still glorifying of a certain visual type of female and male. There are, you know, when people say, but look at Lupita. Okay, I'm looking at Lupita, but who else am I looking at, right? If somebody says, but Lupita one more time, you know, it's like one person doesn't say, oh, we've figured this all out, right? I'm still seeing, you know, the idea that this idea of in the Latino community, I mean, I see progress in the natural hair movement in the Latino community, for example, but I also still see so many ideals of lighter skin preference, let's say. So I guess after I write a book, I'm like, okay, problem solved. Let's move on. And then you're like, wait a minute, why are people still talking about the same ridiculous things? Why are still people glorifying whiteness? Like, didn't they get the memo that this was all part of a conspiracy of white supremacy and colonialism? Like, come on, I just told you the truth. Like, now you know, so stop. I wish that was
that memo more widely, Lori.
I know.
Right. Yeah. Everybody gets the memo.
It's just translated in 17,000 languages. But it's when I kind of recognized the deep-seated kind of intentionality of white supremacy and colonialism, and how whiteness was weaponized. Literally, whiteness was weaponized, and how we all fell for it. Right? Like, everybody, like, across the globe fell for it. And it's the dumbest thing ever, because what do white people want to do more than anything? Get tan. It's so insane. Like, it's so insane. There's no benefit to literally white skin. You burn more. Like, there's just nothing, like, physically, there's no benefit to having pale skin. Right? And so, yet, people are killing themselves with, like, whitening creams and lightening creams and chemicals in the hair. Mm-hmm. For what? There's nothing at the basis of this desire. So all that to say, I do see people today more than ever interrogating, and the social media can be very helpful, because we see a lot of young people using their social media accounts, challenging beauty images and things like that. That gives me hope. I wish there was more substantial change about I just saw a fight on Facebook between very intelligent women still saying light-skinned women are this and that, and dark-skinned women, and it was like, really? We are still having team dark skin versus team light skin? Who has it, the oppression Olympics between who's more, who suffers more? And I'm like, we are never going to get past this if we are still trying to compare whose tragedy is worse. So I'm hopeful, but I still see we have a long way to go.
Well, we really could have spoken for a lot longer. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lori, for this great conversation. And I hope you all get the memo, which is Lori's book. And really, it's really fascinating. And they're really part two. There could be, we could have a longer conversation about it, what we're all doing in our families to counter this, and how we particularly teach kids to be critical of media. Once you do we're a bouquet of flowers, you got to talk about power in media so that kids can see a different way, right? So thank you, everyone, for coming. Lori, thank you for just sharing so much, and for your insights, and for writing this book, which meant a lot to me to read. So I hope you guys, we'll be sending you guys the video, the resources, everything that we've spoken about sometime soon. Maybe not tomorrow, but sometime soon. And you'll be able to follow up and put some of these great suggestions to use. So thank you.
Hate to be greedy, Lori, but hope you keep bringing your gifts. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me. It was wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night. Bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.